All right, you ready for this?
Ready.
Hey everyone, this is Tom Salemi of Device Talks. Welcome back to the Device Talks Weekly Podcast, or of course, if this is your first time here, welcome. Thanks for joining us. We've got a most excellent episode for you today. First, I'm going to introduce a segment of an interview I did with Martha Ha and Jon de Csepel of Medtronic. It's from our MedtronicTalks podcast series. Again, this is just an excerpt. I just want to share what was part of an important conversation. I spoke with Martha and Jon about the work that's going on within Medtronic to encourage employees of Asian and Pacific Island descent to really advocate for themselves and to find a way to succeed in the corporation. It's, I think, an important message. And if you want to hear the entire episode, please look for the Medtronic Talks podcast on the podcast channel that you're listening to this podcast on, or if you're on the website, devicetalks.com, listening to this, you can find Medtronic Talks there as well. But again, I wanted to share at least a bit of that conversation, and you can find the rest at Medtronic Talks. Later on, I'll speak with Josh Makower. Everyone knows Josh, or I think most people do. He is an innovator extraordinaire. He is going to be taking over at Stanford Biodesign, an effort he helped co-found with Paul Yock back in the 90s. Paul Yock is retiring. Josh is moving in to take over as director, and it seems like a perfect fit for someone who has spent his life just creating wonderful medical devices, but also teaching others to innovate, teaching others to create medical devices, and developing a system. And Josh explains why developing a system was important to him. So it was a fun conversation. Josh has some interesting roots or an interesting origin story, I'll say, into medtech. He'll share what inspired him initially to enter the sector. And it's a bit of a visual conversation. I'll try to share some of the images on social media. It was a lot of fun. So this is a great conversation. Thanks for pushing play and for joining us. Now I'd like to bring in my podcast partner, Chris Newmarker, executive editor of Life Sciences at Mass Device. Chris Newmarker, welcome back.
Good to be here, Tom. Good to be here, man. Here we are.
Godzilla and I missed you, Chris, didn't we, Godzilla?
Aww. I mean, Sean probably had a good time with Godzilla, though, right?
Godzilla was a little shy. He didn't come out for Sean, but Sean did a great job.
Oh,
Sean is a star in the making. He's more than ready to take over for us once we're, well, you know what happens to old people like us. So
we win.
That's right. we win. We're the big winners.
That's
so I got
right.
some big news, Chris. I know all of our podcast listeners want to hear this.
You won the $1 million?
Very important announcement. I did not win the Ohio vaccine. I learned I was ineligible because I don't live in Ohio.
Yeah, that would be tough.
Doesn't seem fair. Yeah. But I found my car keys.
You did.
I did.
Congratulations.
There they are right here.
Wow.
Yeah. They're in my brown shorts all along. You know, it was a hot day. I'd forgotten, and I put it back up on the short shelf, and then I pulled the shorts down again a couple of days ago. Boom! Keys. Just like that.
Just like that.
But now I've got my Apple AirTag on it, so that shan't happen again, my friend. Now I'll be able to beep that into Discovery, so all is good.
I've got to get one of those. I've had my moments where like I have a lot of things to do, and all of a sudden I can't find my keys. That's just the worst.
They come in packs of 4, so there's one for every new marker. You can.
Could you send me one, Tom?
Ours have all been claimed.
Please?
3 by me, 1 by my oldest son. They've all been claimed already. But
all right,
you've got a humdinger of a new markers newsmaker. So let's get started on number 5.
Got a good one. You know, number 5 ran in full on our sister site, Drug Discovery and Development, and this is just an interesting story. I mean, the Wall Street Journal, kind of broke the news, and other media outlets followed that there was a previously undisclosed U.S. intelligence report that revealed that there were 3 scientists in the Wuhan lab, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, became sick enough in November 2019 to seek hospital care. So interesting circumstances, and it's interesting too that none other than Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA administrator, saying, I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence around this, but.
Yeah, no, that certainly does add credence, and I think now is the time for us to really start pushing and delving into this origin story. I mean, obviously, other countries are still very much struggling with the virus, and we should help them through that. But now is the time to definitely dig a little deeper and find out what the story is behind there, because there are some gaps, right? Some questions.
Yeah, and it's good to find out like where exactly this came from, so that we can prevent this from happening again. Since this was hopefully the past year was hopefully the one of the toughest years in history that I've lived through. So, it'd be nice for it not to happen again. So we've got, and I've been reading news reports too that President Biden says that he wants intelligence agencies to get more information together. On the flip side, the Chinese government is accusing the U.S. of hiding something. So, it would be nice if there's less finger pointing and we could just get to the bottom of what happened.
That would be swell.
That would be swell.
That would be swell, but we'll see where things go. But normalcy is starting to return. As I mentioned at the start, I had lunch with our colleague Marianne Cook today, and
a networking lunch,
and a representative from one of our fine sponsors, Finnegan. So it's great to sit outside in the shade.
Wow.
Share salad. Well, we didn't share a salad. We each had our own salads, but it was good to get out. All right, let's move into number 4 on the New Markets Newsmakers.
Number 4 on the list, we've got Rapid Medical raising $50 million to support its minimally invasive stroke treatments. But this money raise comes on the heels of FDA clearing the company's Tiger Triever revascularization device to treat ischemic stroke. So it includes intelligent control, like to help the neurointerventionalists better remove blood clots, restore blood flow to the brain. So I mean, this is just interesting technology. FDA cleared now, and the company's now raised $50 million to work on commercializing it.
All right. Let us move on to number 3.
Number 3 on the list, we've got iRhythm. iRhythm's on the list this time, and they've won an FDA clearances for like a next gen Zio monitor. Also won a clearance for some updated artificial intelligence capabilities with their Zio system, which is kind of this cardiac monitoring patch that detects AFib, kind of like it's supposed to be like a much better thing than the traditional Holter monitors that have been used in the past. So, able to, track, people for a longer period of time, hopefully, figure out better whether people have, have any AFib problems. So yeah, this is neat. They got a clearance to, for some, next gen technology.
We of course had Mike Coyle, the CEO, on the podcast a few weeks ago. And iRhythm sort of represents the new dilemma for medtech. We talked about it with Josh Makower, our guest on the podcast today. About 10 years ago, the FDA was the real hurdle. Now the FDA seems more amenable, but it's reimbursement that's becoming the real challenge. And that's what iRhythm is facing as well. So
yeah, exactly. They've got here they are with getting an FDA clearance, but they're, wrangling with a regional Medicare administrator right now over pricing. And that pricing thing doesn't just affect them, but some other companies too that are active in this space. So yeah, it's not just like getting the regulatory approval these days. It's trying to get the stuff paid for.
Hey, Device Talkers. On June 8th, we're going to have a Device Talks Tuesdays presentation by Elcom. I've got a quick conversation with Mike Goglia. Mike's the regional market manager in the Americas for Elcom Silicones. And the topic of the conversation is solving medtech's challenges using medical grade silicone. So I asked Mike what the webinar will look like. Let's listen.
The way we have the webinar broken out, it'll be 3 separate sections that discuss real case studies that are real life situations that occurred with our customers. Mm-hmm. And we truly try to have a consultative approach when we deal with our customer base. They might be looking for one solution, but we could have other options to offer them. Okay. So the first case study we'll go into would be it's around a global company that we have a relationship with that was looking to transfer technologies to another site. So we were able to tweak our formulations and actually make a better product for them in the end that worked in both of their locations. The second one was a customer had come to us with a problem looking for a better adhesive for one of their medical devices. They were leaning in one direction, and we actually steered them in another direction that fit within their current manufacturing process, and actually gave them a much faster cure time and much faster cycle time within their processing. And then the last bit we'll go into is more of an example about how we deal with our customers on the regulatory side with a medical device. Obviously, it's an ever-changing environment for our customer base, and we try to have expertise throughout the different zones we deal in, whether it be the Americas, Asia Pac, or Europe. And we have toxicologists on staff, we have regulatory personnel on staff.
Okay, it's going to be a great conversation. Join us on June 8th at 11 a.m. It's going to be a special time, 11 a.m. on June 8th. Go to devicetalks.com to register. Martha and Jon de Csepel, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Tom.
Hi, Tom.
Martha, you're a first-time visitor. Jon, you are our first returning guest to the MedtronicTalks podcast. I think if you come on a third time, I have to get you a Screen Actors Guild card or something. I'm sure the unions will get involved. But it's great to have you back. Jon, we covered your background when you were on our first podcast. So Martha, I'm going to focus on you for a few minutes. Tell us a bit about how you came to be where you are at Medtronic, your Chief Privacy Officer. A little later, I'd love to learn exactly what you focus on, but take us way back. What's your background?
So I was born, Tom, in Korea, actually, in Seoul, Korea. And my family moved to the United States, to the Chicagoland area when I was less than a year old. And as I was I was thinking about my history and making notes for this podcast, I started thinking back to my childhood. And I hope this is relevant because I was trying to remember specific instances of discrimination and racism that I may have faced growing up as a young Asian female on the streets of Chicago. And I remembered a fair amount of name calling. But then as I actually just sat with it, I remembered being taunted as a child. I remember kids, pulling their eyes into little slits and then laughing at me and pointing at me. One of the boys, actually, when I was in elementary school, challenged me to a fight. So, wow. Yeah. And
for any reason other than you being you, or
I guess I was intimidating. I don't know. Maybe I look different, or and for those of you who can't see me, I'm actually about 5'2", 110, and I was even smaller back then. So luckily we didn't fight. So that all ended up. But then I remember this one incident very clearly of going to a department store with my mom. And I remember these two boys following me as we went from department to department. And finally, when I was cornered, they started calling me names. They started teasing me. And to the point where I literally shrunk down to the ground and I hid underneath some clothes, under a rack of clothes. And I wanted to become invisible. I never told my mom or dad about this. I felt ashamed. Mm-hmm. I felt embarrassed. I felt helpless. And then from there, as I grew up, I guess I feel like there was less blatant racism and discrimination, but I'm also thinking that maybe I just became numb to it.
Right.
And I just started to ignore it. Anyway, fast forward, I graduated from law school.
I wonder, before you get into that, I do want to, because I find myself going back to my own childhood, I was taunted for other reasons, but racially, growing up in the 70s and the 80s, you kind of look at things that you said or just thoughts that you had and how they compared to today. And it really requires you to stop and really think and really hold it up to the light and compare one to the other. Did you carry these memories with you in an active way through the years, or are you sort of unpacking them now?
I'm unpacking a lot of the really what I consider more nasty and blatant racism. I do remember just the teasing and some of the name calling. Mm-hmm. That's kind of simple, and I can carry that with me. And I never have forgotten that, but I just do what I have to move past it. Sure. And I think now more than ever, especially as the leader of the Asian Employee Resource Group at Medtronic, it's really time for me to bring those to the light and to the surface and talk
Sure.
about it, because I think that's important, not just for myself, but also for the other Asian employees. And it's time to speak up and it's time to speak out. So
No, I think we all should be doing that. But please, so you moved into you were getting into your move to law school.
yeah, actually, I had graduated from law school and worked.
I missed that entirely. Wow. Okay. Congratulations.
Oh, I remember it. So I graduated from law school, started working in law firms for about 10 years. And then I went in-house in a healthcare company. And I started to move up the ranks. And I thought that I was moving up the ranks because I worked hard, because that's what my mom and dad said. You work hard, keep your head down, and people will notice you. Well, some people did, and it was okay for a while. And then nobody noticed me. And so really, the way I got to rise in the ranks to the executive level is really from some lucky breaks and from people actually extending a hand to me saying, you got to get pulled up right now. So I had luckily some great mentors and sponsors who brought me up with them.
How did you choose healthcare, or did you just did healthcare happen to choose you? Did you consciously choose a career in healthcare?
I did not. Actually, healthcare chose me, and it just happened to be a good company. It happened to be not far from my house. And I thought, hey, I can do this. It's a good cause. And so it worked out that way.
Perfect. Great.
So I joined Medtronic about 5 years ago, again, staying in healthcare. And I became the leader of the Asian ERG about 18 months ago. And I've always been a supporter of IND, inclusion and diversity, and mentoring and supporting other Asians and females and Asian females. But I never really knew how or whether I could make a difference. I remember that I became numb to my own racism and microaggressions against myself. But so the events of the last 12 months have really woken me up. And it's time now to take a stand. It's time to find my voice, if not for myself, for all my other fellow Asian colleagues, my friends, the community. It's time and I'm ready. And so here I am speaking up and speaking out.
Great. No, good for you. And I, Jon, I want to bring you into the conversation in a moment, but Martha, do you say the event of the last 12 months, do you specifically have a moment or an event where you said enough is enough, or was it sort of a cumulative building?
I did have a moment when enough is enough. And that was actually just this March. I started to wake up a little bit more clearly over the course of the pandemic, as we saw the rise in anti-Asian racism and violence escalate. But then the Atlanta murders back in March of the 6 Asian women. And then I started to watch very, very disturbing violent attacks against mostly elderly Asian men and women. And then I started thinking about my parents who are in their 80s. And it literally broke my heart. So
those videos were immensely we've all seen them, and it just boggles the mind that they can happen that no one was helping. So I can understand that completely. Wow. Okay. Well, we want to get into the work being done at Medtronic, but I think, Jon, I would love to bring you into the conversation. Just maybe I'm not sure who to speak to the program, but I think though this would be a good time to talk about the group you're involved with at Medtronic and what you're trying to do. And maybe, Jon, you can sort of start that and explain what perspective you're bringing to this important discussion.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. I'm still thinking about what Martha just said about how she was, as a junior executive, she wasn't recognized for her performance, and she ultimately had to depend on some people to give her a hand up. And how unfortunate is that? Because we should all be recognized for our performance and not necessarily need someone to go out of their way to help us. But that is our reality. So I've tried to do my part. I've recently had the honor of participating in a development program that we have for mid-level Asian women executives in our company, and where we have a number of mentor-mentee sessions, and having an appreciation of some of the challenges that our Asian workforce has, and speaking to them very directly and very frankly with my mentee has been really rewarding for me. I could share with you some of the things that we spoke about if you think that'd be valuable.
Sure. Let's cover a few of those things now.
Some of the things that we spoke of included the importance of not just completing your assignments, but taking it a step farther and having the confidence to look to influence the company's decision making. And we spoke about how do you do that. We also spoke about the importance of getting out of the office and going to see customers and then bringing that back to the conference room, if you will, and being the voice of the customer. So shaking things up and getting out of the usual role is something that some of our Asian employees may struggle with. And so encouraging her to do these things was rather eye-opening. And hopefully that will help her to break through, if you will, the glass ceiling. And we know that glass ceiling exists because we've seen the studies that show that amongst U.S. white-collar professionals, that Asians are the least likely to go from individual contributor to the managerial ranks. So having an opportunity to talk about kind of specific ways of moving up, how you can be very intentional, maybe even double down on the intentionality of your career development by talking to your manager about succession planning, and are you named in their succession plan, are important for anyone, but probably doubly important for our Asian American employees.
All right, once again, if you'd like to hear the rest of that interview, including Jon's personal connection to this issue, go to devicetalks.com. You can find the Medtronic Talks podcast there, or subscribe on any podcast channel, or you can go to the medtronics.com website and find it there in this newsroom. So make sure you check that out. All right, let us move on to number... Oh, no.
Yes, I know.
Come on, Chris.
It's getting a lot of clicks on Mass Device. People just can't get enough of the Elizabeth Holmes Theranos trial. But there were some big developments though, in recent days, because the judge sorted through all of the motions that were flying back and forth over what evidence to include in the trial. So they're finally on May 22nd a 100-page order landed that went through all this stuff and cleared it up for before the August 31st trial starts. So some of the high points included that there will be some discussion about her lavish lifestyle, though the judge said no brand names that could bias the jurors against her, because they could, if you were talking about her having Gucci bags or whatever, that wouldn't be good. But you can definitely talk about how she was enjoying a lifestyle that you'd get as a Silicon Valley CEO when you're trying to establish some kind of motive for why all this fraud took place with Theranos. It was interesting too. The prosecutors all along have been kind of trying to suggest that she was behind destroying this laboratory information system database, and the judge said that he didn't see any direct evidence in what they were presenting, so they can't make that case during the trial. And on the flip side, she can't fault the government for the database being lost. So if she does that, she opens up a question of fact in the trial, and then it's fair game. The prosecutors can start trying to suggest that she something happened with Theranos management and the destruction of it. So that's very interesting. We'll see. But anyway, it'll be quite. It looks like it's shaping out to be quite a trial.
Do we know if this is going to be a Zoom trial or if this is going to be an old-fashioned in-person only trial?
I don't. I know one of the reasons why they delayed it. Other than the fact they found out she's there's a pregnancy now, but she's expecting. But also during the pandemic, some of the she had a lot of older investors, elder statesmen who invested in Theranos, people like Henry Kissinger. And, it's it'd be very hard to do a Zoom testimony with them, but you don't really want them coming into a courtroom during a pandemic. So Rupert Murdoch's on the witness list. Wow. Last time I checked.
If I didn't know you the way I do Chris Newmarker, I would think you keep putting this on the list so you can justify a trip to the West Coast to cover this trial for yourself. Is that what's going on?
We do have, Brian Bunt's our farm editors, and he lives outside of San Francisco. Maybe I kind of teased Brian. Maybe he should go. He might have to stop by a few times. We'll see.
If we're getting this many clicks, then I think we got to set him up there with a camera. A little bit. We can have Mass Device live on the scene.
Yeah, exactly. There we go. We got to have some live coverage of this. It'll be. It's definitely the most high profile trial that medtech has seen ever. I don't know. Yeah,
for sure. Heck, there was a podcast built around it, so it had to be a big deal.
There's a podcast. Is this your idea? Are you going to start a Theranos podcast, Tom? Are we going to start? I think they've gone to the bottom of a lot of what happened around that at this point.
Yeah, I think they pretty much answered many of the questions. So, but maybe I'll do a podcast about the Theranos podcast. That would be great. People would love that. Number one on the New Marcus Newsmakers.
Number one on the list, just hot off the presses. Are there? Even though there aren't any presses anymore, but still, it's Thursday, and Medtronic fourth quarter results are out, and I was just looking over the earnings transcript, and in there, CEO Jeff Martha was told analysts that the company's Hugo robot just got a investigational device exemption approval from FDA, so this lets them start studying this robot in the U.S. with commencement of trial for urologic procedures. But this is like a big thing. This is like Medtronic's big play to compete with Intuitive Surgical in the soft tissue robotic surgery space. So some big news for Medtronic on the surgical robot front. And another thing that Martha kind of mentioned that I thought was really interesting was that they're expecting to have renal denervation trial results later this year, likely at the TCT conference in November. And Martha said that he thought that those results are quote unquote likely to be one of the most highly anticipated events in medtech this year. Renal denervation had a big setback as a hypertension treatment about half a decade ago because Medtronic had a study that didn't meet, endpoints, but, since then they went back, they, started, sorting through factors that had, played a role in that, trial and, including trying to clear up confounding factors such as differing medication regimens and whatnot, patient compliance. And they're back and, gosh, if this study goes really well, renal denervation can really be back as kind of like this next big thing for medtech. The idea that high blood pressure is so hard for some people to control. If you really could kind of zap some of these nerves leading to the kidneys to regulate blood pressure, that would be very useful and a huge market.
Sure. No, I've already shared my enthusiasm for renal denervation, and I'm certainly anticipating those results highly. And the IDE affords Medtronic the opportunity to begin its human clinical trials. Correct.
IDE means you can ship out devices to study it. Exactly.
All right. Well, great news. Well, great job, Chris Newmarker. It's an excellent list as always.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, a lot of news going on. So much for slow summertime so far.
Well, Josh Makower, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's great to connect with you again. We did a podcast on a different podcast a couple of years ago, and I thought of it this morning. There was an article in the Globe about AAPI creating a prosthetic hand for a young woman who was in an accident. Reminded me that and I always ask this question to people coming on the podcast. I asked it then, I'll ask it now. What was I remember your inspiration for getting into medtech. It was the $6 million man.
Exactly. You're right.
Yeah. So and again, this article reminded me of that. And just tell us, what was it? That inspired everybody, but what was it that you saw that said, hey, you know what? That might be a career for me. I don't want to be the superhero. Yeah. I want to be Oscar Madison. Yeah. I want to be the guy behind the guy.
I'm going to show you something that I've never shared publicly in a podcast. So this could be fun. So this is a notebook from when I was probably 7 years old or something like that.
Whoa.
And being inspired by, the $6 million man. And I've wrote all my ideas in this notebook. That's the lungs, see?
That's awesome.
All the things that you could do. Here's the things you could do. You could stimulate the heart with electricity.
You were how old?
I was like 7.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So like, and then I have all my ideas of the super things that people, what you could do to the body, and like if you stimulated various. So, that was my inspiration. And I mean, my parents had held on to this notebook, and like there's my network of how everything's connected in the body. And it's like, it shows you that like how impactful those kinds of things could be for kids, like that inspired my whole career. Like just I was totally fascinated with the idea that I can't even spell right here. It's the brain with electrodes in the brain. I mean, it's just like, so cool. Like I just dreamed about it. Like, wow, what could you do to improve health and people, the bionic man, make people better, like superpowers and, all that kind of stuff. And so that's where it started.
That's outstanding.
My first invention notebook right here.
This is a 29 cent yellow paper notebook that would fit in your back pocket of your jeans. Did you remember that you had done that, or were you 20 something?
Yes, I need to go to Medtronic and say, hey, I have the notebooks. I invented everything first.
You got to get that over to Wilson Sonsini and get some court cases going. I think
exactly. Right there. It's all been invented. I want that founder stock.
That's awesome. And this is the weakness of a podcast, not be able to show people that. But again, it's worn yellow notebook, the kind of small one you would have found in your back pocket, or put in your back pocket, and it's got all these great drawings that young Josh did. And I'll correct myself, Oscar Goldman, not Oscar Madison. That Oscar Madison, of course, was The Odd Couple. Oscar Goldman was from $6 Million Man. So before anyone shuts the podcast off and writes me a nasty email, well, that backs up your story. Then that's not just a just a tale. So you went into the engineering field. Just walk us through your path to where you currently are.
The thumbnail, I got a mechanical engineering sort of biomedical and emphasis from MIT, worked on electrodes that attach to nerves and stuff like that as my thesis at MIT. But instead of pursuing biomedical engineering pathway, I wanted to do traditional medicine because I wanted to understand how doctors think. And really, I wanted to get closer to patient care, and biomedical engineering seemed like more theoretical and more, analytical. And I wanted to get my hands dirty. I wanted to really understand how patients are treated and real disease. So I went to medical school at NYU, and I got that, and that was, it was right in the middle of the AIDS crisis. So there was a lot of stuff going on. And then as I began to, finish my training at NYU, that's where I was like, I don't know if I want to go practice medicine. I really want to build technologies for doctors to use.
Was that ever a possibility? Was it a possible path? Yeah,
it was. I wish I had role models like Tom Fogarty or maybe Paul Yock or people like that. In the East Coast, I didn't even know those names, really. I didn't have anybody who is doing both. And all I saw was doctors who were immersed and totally busy and had no time to do anything else other than treating patients. And I was like, you know what? I like the patient care piece. It's actually really rewarding and fulfilling, but I wanted to get involved in innovation sooner. So I thought that by going to a company, I could be part of a product development effort that would develop new technologies for treating disease. And that's what I wanted to do. So that's why I went into industry. And I went to Pfizer medical devices at the time. Pfizer had a big $2 billion medical device business at the time, which comprised of orthopedic business, cardiology business, lasers, all sorts of things, urology. And so it was a great overview, and got involved in some really interesting projects. And that's where I started this interest in sort of the process of innovation. And I was asked to investigate why, when Pfizer would acquire these little startups that were very innovative, and then they'd not create new exciting things anymore. Everything that they would do after that would be somewhat incremental. And Hank McKinnell, who was the CFO at the time, who later became the CEO of Pfizer, asked me to go find this out. And I discovered that what happens with businesses, once they find their success, they start to define themselves on the basis of the technology rather than the need that they're solving. So that led me to this thesis that if you stay focused on the need and you stay focused on the customer, you will find your way to the next big innovative ideas. And if you just stay fixated, like we're a catheter company, we're a laser company, we're a implant company. And so that becomes much more limiting, and everything becomes much more incremental. And so he said, okay, go prove it. And I created a little group that we called Fresh Tech to prove the methodology could work. We did that series of times and produced a number of interesting new product development efforts within medical devices. And then after, I went to Columbia Business School in the executive program, came back, stayed with Pfizer through that and 2 years after. And by then I was sort of like, you know what, I am frustrated with the big company. A lot of our ideas sort of struggled to get traction because of not invented here and a lot of politics. And I was like, you know what, I need to go do this outside of a big company because it's too frustrating. That's when I became an entrepreneur in 1995. I teamed up with NEA and John Nera and Bob Anderson, who is the former, founder of Valley Lab. And we created ExploreMed as a medical device incubator back then, and still to this day, creating companies out of ExploreMed. And we produced, some big exits like NeoTract and Acclarent and Willow and MoxyMed and some other, interesting technology. We have a new one that's in the aesthetic space that's codenamed NC8, sort of stealth at the moment. But so we're still creating companies there. And NEA has been my partner since 1995. And, 15 or 16 years ago, I joined as a venture partner part-time, just sort of advising. And then 6 years ago as a general partner. And that's when I sort of switched to do a lot more investing. And that's what I've been doing for the last 6 years. Simultaneously, about 20 years ago, Paul Yock and I co-founded the biodesign program at Stanford.
Let's get into that. Yeah. So you went to MIT, you went to New York University, you went to Columbia, and then you go to the West Coast. I just wanted to ask about the medical degree. How is that, if you were giving advice to someone today who said, I really would like to get into biomed, but I think it would help me a lot if I get my MD. Is that still necessary today?
Yeah, nothing is necessary. Because I have a lot of engineers that I work with who are not MDs, who are as salient in heart valves or implantable technology as any doc that would walk into the room. So you can become an expert without having to be a doctor. The thing that I really appreciate about the medical degree is it gave me an understanding of patient care and really a deep, deep understanding of physiology. And there's some amazing experiences that, both business school and medical school provided that, just being able to go do that actually really enriched me. Is it necessary? I don't think so. But I have a three-dimensional understanding of all of the elements and layers and structural components of the human body, which really gives me a rich platform upon which to do inventing, So I can visualize in my mind when we're approaching sort of how do we solve this sort of whatever mechanical problem. And a lot of, as you probably know, a lot of my, contributions on the innovation and inventing side are mechanical solutions to things. I just sort of think mechanically. That's sort of what I'm drawn to. And being able to understand the machine of the body and the layers and the interconnectivity of it and the structural integrity and the viscoelastic properties of the tissues, because I've felt them in all my hands, and having done dissections gives me a really strong foundation when we start inventing and say, we're going to go do this. And I can imagine the tension on this, of the structures as you push them away and what kind of environment that we're penetrating and the blood vessels and all that kind of stuff. It's all sort of in my head. So it helps me as an inventor. Is it necessary? I don't think so, but it definitely helps.
Do you have that same vision of inventing and innovating? Because you mentioned you went to the West Coast, you co-created ExploreMed, and then we'll get to talk more about Stanford Biodesign later, co-created Stanford Biodesign. I mean, you were really giving almost, I don't know, you're either a good entrepreneur, you have the how do you don't, but there was no way to do it, but you were helping to create a way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, when I was in engineering school, the bottom line is I can't understand anything that's complex. Actually, for me to understand it, I just have to break it down into like step one, well, put your shoes on. Step two, walk out of your room. I mean, so, it's like I have to think of things like
sound like my 12-year-old.
And even when I was like a TA or like I TA'd system dynamics at MIT, and I broke it all down into steps. Like for me, it was just like, what are the steps? And so I naturally approach things in sort of system thinking, which is there's a process, there's like one box and an arrow, and there's another box, and what are the steps, and try to abstract it a little bit and say step away from it, like how would I approach this, and let me break that. And as I solve problems that way too, just sort of like, okay, you got this big thing and it's disease, what's going on, and can we think of the steps? So it's just a natural way I approach things, mostly because I can't understand anything that's too complex. So I need to break it down into simple steps. And what's nice about that is once you do that, it's easy to communicate and teach others to do the same thing. So it helps me. And if I can explain it in simple steps to you, you can do it.
So does Stanford Biodesign happen without ExploraMed? Like did ExploraMed kind of give you we've kind of figured it out. Now we can teach it to other people? What
I would say is my experience at Pfizer Fresh Tech, where we first pioneered these things and we iterated.
Josh is reaching back into his bookcase again. Let's see what other treasure trove he pulls out.
This is from 1994.
There's American Medical Systems.
American Medical Systems, which was a Pfizer division at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And we used the Fresh Tech, now called the Biodesign process, to create new ideas in urology for AMS. And the steps are simple and they have not changed.
Wow, really?
Yeah. They're pretty much the same steps of need finding, need specification, inventing to a need spec, then screening those ideas against the need criteria for the ones that work the best.
Is that a formula for innovating in any industry, or is that only work in biomed?
Nope. Any industry.
Mm-hmm.
If you're trying to solve a problem, I think if you're an artist creating art, you don't use that method. But if you're trying to solve problems, this is the way to do it. I mean, and believe it or not, this is controversial in some circles here in the Valley.
Oh, really?
I won't mention any big company names that, are in my backyard here, but some of them believe that you just make stuff, throw it out there, and if people like it, people like it. And, and it's a winner. And if people don't like it, then, just kill it. That's really hard to do in medical.
Yeah.
And you can't just say, hey, we're going to try this therapy. What's it good for? I don't know. I don't know. Let's see how it works. Would you like to take this pill?
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. And so you have to be much more thoughtful, and your risks and expense of getting to the point of even testing it is so expensive that having a thoughtful approach towards identifying needs and screening them is the right way. But I do believe it is applicable to any industry, any opportunity. If you do need finding first, understand your stakeholders, understand the need parameters that you need to solve, and use that as a basis for starting the inventing process, then you have a better chance of being successful than those people just sort of locked away in a garage coming up with great ideas that may or may not actually solve a problem.
So did you and Paul co-create Stanford Biodesign to implement those lessons, to teach those to others?
Yes.
And how has it worked in your opinion? Has it changed at all? Have you had to update that philosophy from what you've seen? What's the experience been like? And we can talk a bit about your taking it over again for Paul in a bit.
ExploraMed was an opportunity to do it in an incubator that had some specific goals, which were really NEA's goals for what types of technologies they wanted to back and how big and how significant. So that was like the types of things that we would pursue was pretty much coned down to the things that would fit NEA's investment practice. When we went to Stanford, it blew open wide the doors of what would be. I mean, you could have an outcome of the biodesign process to be a new research project. It didn't have to be a company. It didn't have to be a product. It could just be, hey, we really understand this problem now. Now let's do some basic research and figure it out. So it could be anything from a new product or technology or drug or something all the way over to a interesting new avenue of research where you now really understand what you need to solve, and let's understand more about the system so we can invent to it. So it's really opened it all up. And it has been really impactful on a number of layers. First of all, we've graduated like 185 fellows who are the folks that go through the intense program. I don't know it's tens of thousands of students have gone through the biodesign training at Stanford in the graduate classes. And then globally, our textbook has been picked up across the world. Literally, universities across the United States and the world use our textbook to train students on innovating in medical technology. So the ideas, they're simple, they're really simple, but they've been transferable across many cultures. It's cool.
Do you have any kind of direct affiliation with them, or do they just buy the textbook and kind of take it from there?
I think there's about eight programs with a direct affiliation where we collaborated with them on a faculty or resources basis. And I'm going to guess like 100 that just use our textbook and, do sort of their own thing.
So what impact has that had on biomedical innovation? Are you seeing a corresponding surge because there's so many people who are now skilled in the art or the science of creating new medical devices?
I mean, it's hard. I haven't measured it.
Yeah.
It's interesting to measure. Maybe once I get into Stanford, I'll try to think about how do we actually measure the actual impact of it. But I do constantly come across founders and students and of the biodesign teachings, whether they got it at Stanford or elsewhere, that sort of identify the textbook as being really useful for them. I think it would be a very interesting survey at some point to do.
It would be.
But I haven't done it.
I mean, I do think, and maybe it's just we're more connected now, but I do see a lot of innovative companies or ideas coming from somewhere other than the big three pockets, West Coast, Minnesota, Massachusetts. Whether they have the infrastructure or the ecosystem to support them and to be companies is a different story, but innovation is happening in a lot of different places as a result. How has the venture world kind of changed over that time? I mean, you work closely and still do. You're still working with NEA, but it's a lot different than it was when you started Stanford Biodesign. Is it better than it was? Is it worse than it was? I don't want to say better or worse. More supportive, less supportive?
We've always had a really great support from the venture community for biodesign. So that's been a fundamental thread of support. But with respect to the venture community itself, I mean, we've waxed and waned. Devices had a heyday, and then there was the global financial crisis and the FDA, crisis. And then that wiped out a number of VCs. And then little by little, the early stage investing and device investing has been coming back. And now I think it's really coming back. I mean, we've seen the greatest number of early stage medical device companies go public, I think, ever. That's exciting because that means that there's liquidity for investors. They're being rewarded for investing in medtech, and they want to put more money to work, and the valuations are good, and the companies are good, and they're holding their value, and it's a really good time. And that will drive, if it hasn't already, more M&A at better prices for innovators, and maybe it'll drive M&A earlier, which is also a big component of a healthy ecosystem. So I think from a lot of perspectives, the medtech ecosystem, starting with, FDA reform that I think really started to get some real traction under Jeff Shuren's leadership after 2012, and the Innovation Act that was passed. I think all that stuff coalesced to drive the real value that we're seeing today in medtech. So I think we're in an upswing. Medtech is definitely delivering on returns, delivering on value for patients, and you're seeing a lot of people enter the field. So it's nice to see a lot of young people. I remember there was a period of time where you look across an audience of medtech executives, and there's a lot of gray hair in the audience. And I think it's nice to see younger people entering the field with a lot of enthusiasm and ideas. So
I used to be one of the younger people in the audience. I remember back in the day. No more. Let's talk about the FDA just a bit, because you did, we talked with Kwame Elmer from UCLA. They're revisiting your study or your survey of the FDA that was done 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago. Why did you talk a bit about that study? Why did you put it together, and how would you define the impact that it had?
Yeah. Well, look, at the time, if folks aren't listening, remember 2008 was a tough time for everyone, but really tough for medtech. We had the perfect storm of issues. We had the global financial crisis, which was devastating. So access to capital was difficult. But what made it worse was, as investors started to consider, well, where am I going to put my money now? We kept on having come back to our investors and say, I know we said that we were going to be a 510K, but the FDA just decided to PMA. Oh, and by the way, they're not being clear as to what the objectives are for the study. No, in fact, we can't get a study approved because the reviewers, they're not getting back to us, and there's delays, and they're turning over, and all that stuff that was going on at the time was a true disaster for innovation and for patients. And we were in, offices in Washington at both sides of the aisle and the White House and saying, this is a big problem. And what we heard back was, you guys are whining a lot, but we have an equally loud group over here whining that, oh, it's too easy on you. The FDA's let you get away with all sorts of stuff. Your devices are dangerous. What's this 510K thing? It sounds like a free pass. They just didn't understand what the real truth was. And finally, I will say it was Anna Eshu in a meeting that we had with her. She just sort of, in a very direct way, said, guys, I don't want to hear any more about this unless you bring some data. Bring some data. I'm not listening to whining anymore. I hear you don't like it. I hear, bring some data and we'll have a discussion. But until you have data, your opinion is as good as the next person who comes in who's on the other side of the issue. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a very, very valuable input. And so say, okay, let's go get the data. And, I had just sold a Clarent and felt like I had achieved some degree of success. And a lot of my colleagues at the time, because FDA was being very aggressive against companies, people were very afraid. People were afraid to speak out. People were afraid to be named in articles or even to show up at Congress and be named. So it was like, you know what? I've been fortunate. It's time to give back. And I basically stuck my neck out and said, all right, I'll do the study and I'll go to Washington and I'll tell the story. And so basically it was a small group. It was this medical student and Lyndon N from Stanford and myself basically did this 200 or so medical device study where we asked our colleagues to share things that they wouldn't want to share with anybody. We got precise data as to what they spent over what phase of their development, how long things took with FDA and what their feedback was and how long things took and what it used to take and we took a sample of companies that went through earlier and samples that went through later, and we were able to compare how things have gotten worse and how expensive it was. And all that data we basically brought back for use in the debate, and it was very effective. And interestingly, I found out later that Jeff had commissioned a similar study just from the FDA side, which internally validated all of our findings.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I think he also knew that this needed to be changed. And so, while it seemed like, externally, maybe people thought we were adversaries, I think in the end, we became partners and realizing that what we need to do for patients and what we need to do for safety is to have a set of parameters that are predictable, and predictability and reasonability and risk benefit or benefit risk as part of the equation needs to be there. And a lot of the things that got signed into law were those innovations that were developed through the partnership with FDA and industry, and Mark Leahy at MDMA and AdvaMed and NVCA all collaborated, and the local groups, Life Science Alley, and everybody pulled together for this, and it was a great collective team effort with a lot of people involved, and we were successful in establishing and really putting the FDA issue I mean, it's not perfect, but it's much, much better, and it's much more productive.
And it's not, the review isn't less stringent. It's just the expectations are clearer. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, exactly. I mean, it's still hard.
Yeah.
I mean, the bar is high, and it's a little variable depending on which division, which reviewer. There's a lot of variability. That's one of the issues that I think we still have yet to solve. I think there could be some uniformity and some training across the group to make the experience of going through as an applicant more uniform, like it is in the patent office. I think it's somewhat uniform there, but we're a light years better than the way it was in 2008.
And are you collaborating at all, or what's your feelings about the UCLA sort of redoing this survey or a version of it?
They've been very kind. We've been in touch. I've sort of suggested that FDA, redoing the study is more academic than necessary right now, but that there's other things that I would look at, like reimbursement and, like that's, if you were to poll 200 medical device executives right now and say, what's their biggest challenge? It's reimbursement.
Yeah.
It's not FDA, actually. Right. Some would complain about FDA, and there's still reason to complain about certain things. But the big issue is, how do you get your devices paid? The whole process from coding and coverage and payment is so rigid and difficult and opaque. It's a lot like the way FDA was back in 2008. So that's the big issue. And I hope they'll take my advice and focus more on that than necessarily repeat this extensive study that we did on regulatory, because that's, it would be interesting, but more like, hey, yeah, things really improved. Nice thing to do, but I think more impactful would be to say, what can we do to demonstrate that a reimbursement needs to be solved to improve patient access and enhance innovation? That's probably where I'd focus.
That's a great point. I mean, I remember Emphasis back in the day, and I talked to iRhythm recently for the podcast, and the energy is very much the same. I know we're taking a lot of your time. Get a few more minutes. Just I'm curious talk about your role. You've been a general partner at NEA for the past 5 years or so. You're taking over for your co-founder, Paul Yock, at Stanford Biodesign. I know there's a lot of excitement around that. What are the next 2 years look like for you in terms of where you'd be focusing your time, and what are your plans for Stanford?
I'll still have my fingers in my three main pies, which are Stanford, NEA, and ExploraMed. So I'll still be creating new companies through ExploraMed, still a part of the NEA team, but I'm stepping down to special partner. So I'm not going to have the fiduciary responsibility or time requirement that a general partner requires, but I'll still be a part of the med device investing team there. But my main full-time effort will be Stanford. And my goals are to maintain the good things that Stanford Biodesign does, trying to advance diversity in medtech, undergraduate and graduate student classes, the executive programs where we train executives from major multinational companies, and the fellowship program and the innovators workbench and all that stuff. We're going to continue all the good stuff. The one new thing that I think that I'm getting a lot of feedback and traction, I'm on sort of a listening tour at the moment. I haven't started. I start in August, but I think they're getting a lot of good feedback that establishing a thoughtful policy initiative, more in line of a little bit similar to what I did back in 2008 with that study that we published, but more broad. And I'd like to establish what I'd call a innovation policy initiative that really a healthcare innovation policy initiative that really looks at how do the policies that we have at the state, local, and sort of federal level impact healthcare innovation. And that would include everything from regulatory reimbursement, types of policies, all the way through tax policy and financial policy. And I'm interested in asking some of those questions and developing some hopefully thoughtful guidelines and insights that could be used by policymakers to make sure that, that when the next pandemic comes, that we have a ready and available set of technologies and innovators ready to respond to the challenge. We just saved the world with medtech medical innovation because of all the investment that had existed prior to this event coming. Imagine if we were starting from scratch with, RNA vaccines from the get-go. No way. We would still be in hell. But the fact that that innovation ecosystem was so thriving and was able to rise to the challenge is actually a credit to policies that were put in place and that we've been living with. So we have a golden goose here. Let's make sure we don't kill it with policies that might inadvertently damage that ability. So that's what I'm interested in evaluating. Yeah.
It's a new role for Stanford. I mean, less academic and more leadership and policy.
Yeah, I think, we're not going to lobby. There's a rule against lobbying at the Stanford level, but I think what our goal is to really just, with an academic overlay, of course, we're going to approach it in a peer-reviewed fashion with a lot of collaboration. We're going to do it in a way that we're going to provide that data and thoughtful analysis, and we'll let policymakers and other industry groups take that data and use it in hopefully a thoughtful way based on the insights that we're able to provide.
That's great. Well, obviously, I'm a fan of amplifying medtech's voice, so I think that'll certainly help. Josh, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you for the time and for joining us in the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me. Really appreciate it.
All right, it was great to hear from Josh Makower. Chris Newmarker, now is the time when we beg for social media followers. You begin. You go first.
Oh, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter. Just Chris Newmarker. Just like a new marker.
All right, and I am on Twitter at MedTechTom. You can find me on LinkedIn, Tom Salemi. And please do tag Chris and myself when you share this podcast on your social media channels. We'd love to be part of that conversation. So that is a wrap. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Device Talks Weekly Podcast. Once again, don't forget to subscribe. You can do that on any of the major podcast channels. And you can also, of course, find the MedtronicTalks Podcast that we gave you a little snippet of today. Those are on the same channels, Apple, Google, Spotify, you name it, we're out there. So subscribe to both. Be amongst the first to hear them. We have several hundred people listening to the Device Talks Weekly Podcast before we even post it anywhere. So some of you are listening and some of you are subscribing. You all should be doing that as well. All right. Once again, that's it, folks. Tune in next week. We'll have another great episode of the Device Talks Weekly Podcast waiting for you.
Hey, get vaccinated. They're giving out prizes for crying out loud.